Today, I'm figuring out how to turn my algae into a low-cost fertilizer. Hey, I'm Olion, and I'm once again experimenting with microalgae. Last week, I started growing my algae in hanging bags for the very first time, and I set them to grow for about 10 days, which is coming up at the end of this week, which means I need to figure out what I'm going to do with those algae once they're done growing. Now, the plan with this project was always to turn the algae into a low-cost fertilizer. Essentially, when the algae grow, they absorb nitrates and phosphates from the water, which are two nutrients that are really important for growing plants, which makes sense because algae are very similar to plants and therefore they require the same nutrients. The point is that when we harvest the algae from the water, they have stored all that nitrate and phosphate inside of them. And when we apply the algae to the plants, they can act as a low-cost fertilizer. This ties into the whole biorefinery aspect of what I'm working on with this project. Half of the goal is to mass cultivate algae, grow more algae than I've ever grown before. But the other half is to use algae to process raw materials like water, carbon dioxide, nitrates, and phosphates into an actual useful product, like fertilizer. So this second half is almost equally as important as the first half, but I had to get the first half set up first. So now I'm doing research on how to process algae into fertilizer. Now, algae-based fertilizers are a relatively well-researched topic, and I was able to find some research papers online that explained a process of taking the algae and turning it into a fertilizer. So the first step is to run it through a sieve so that you can get rid of any large solids that might have gotten clumped in the way. Then you have to dewater the algae, probably by putting them in some kind of dehydrator, then dry them even further so that they're about 90% solid, and then grind it up into a powder that then you can then apply to the soil. Now, the specific procedure specified in one of the papers I read talks about a 2mm nylon sieve. 2mm being the thickness of the little squares in the sieve that allow things to get through. So I think something like a mosquito net, or something similar to that, would work pretty well for this. Then we have to figure out how to get rid of most of the water. The process is literally called dewatering, and it's what takes up the bulk of the energy and, well, cost in turning algae into a fertilizer. Now, in my case, I happen to have a very convenient food dehydrator here, which will make it pretty easy to just pop the algae in and let all the water evaporate off. And then I'll be able to use a blender, or again, something similar, to grind it up into a powder that I can put on the soil. Now, as I was doing this, I was also thinking it might be interesting to do an experiment with algae fertilizers to see how they actually measurably improve plant growth. So I could get a whole bunch of plants of the same type and add different amounts of algae fertilizers to all of them to see how that impacts their growth. I'd be curious to see how this works, so maybe I'll run that experiment sometime in the next few months once I've accumulated enough algae fertilizer. So what I need to do is use the conversion factor that if I get 1 kilogram of algae biomass, I've captured around 1.8 kilograms of carbon dioxide, which is actually a pretty solid ratio, and part of the reason why algae are in prominent use for carbon capture applications. So to figure this out, what I'm going to have to do is get all the algae in one hanging bag and dry it really, really carefully, and then take that biomass, weigh it, and figure out how much I have. And then I can use that to extrapolate to my 10 hanging bags and figure out how much carbon dioxide they were able to capture. That information will be useful for the future when I begin to scale up this process so that I can figure out how much carbon dioxide is being absorbed in general. So in the next few days, I'll be going to get some of the supplies that I'll need to turn all my algae into fertilizer. And by the end of the week, I'll be harvesting all my algae, processing it into fertilizer, and you can expect a video about that as I'm doing it. So if you want to see me continue with this project, well, make sure to subscribe on YouTube, follow on LinkedIn, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.